Night had fallen over Jerusalem, and beneath the quiet glow of the moon, the city rested in stillness while its king stood awake above it all. King David, the shepherd boy who had risen to power, the warrior who had defeated giants and led nations, stood alone on his rooftop. He had everything a man could ever want: honor, victory, wealth, and a legacy secured in history. Yet in a single unguarded moment, his gaze fell upon a woman below, and that moment would change everything. She was bathing under the night sky, unaware that the eyes of a king had fixed upon her. Her name was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's most loyal soldiers. What began as a glance would soon unfold into a story marked by desire, betrayal, calculated decisions, and consequences that would echo through generations. One king, one woman, one forbidden desire, but what followed was far more than a private failure. It was a chain of events that would shake a kingdom, test the boundaries of power, and raise questions that have endured for centuries. Was Bathsheba simply caught in a moment she could not escape, or did she learn to survive within a system controlled by authority? Did David, the man praised for his devotion to God, cross a line that would forever alter how he was remembered? And how did this moment of weakness become part of a larger story that would eventually connect to a divine promise? Before we go deeper into this extraordinary true story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next was not simply an affair hidden in the shadows. It was the beginning of a crime. David's rise to power had been nothing short of remarkable. He was not born into royalty, nor did he inherit a throne. His journey began in obscurity, tending sheep in the fields, overlooked even by his own family. Yet he was chosen, anointed for a purpose greater than anyone could see at the time. When he faced Goliath, it was not just a battle between a boy and a giant, but a defining moment that set him apart as a man of courage and faith. From that day forward, David became a symbol of strength, a leader whose victories brought security and unity to Israel. His reputation grew, his influence expanded, and eventually he became king. But power changes perspective. The struggles that once shaped him began to fade as comfort took their place. By the time Bathsheba entered his life, David was no longer fighting for survival in the wilderness. He was ruling from a palace, surrounded by luxury and authority. The discipline that had once guided him began to weaken, replaced by a sense of control that few could challenge. Bathsheba's life, on the other hand, was shaped by a very different reality. She was married to Uriah, a soldier whose loyalty to David was unquestioned. Uriah was among the king's elite warriors, a man who had likely risked his life in battles that secured David's throne. His dedication was not just professional, it was deeply personal. He served his king with honor, trusting in his leadership without hesitation. Bathsheba lived within this world, connected to it through her husband, yet bound by the expectations placed upon her. In a society where power was concentrated in the hands of men, and especially in the hands of a king, her position was one of vulnerability. When David sent for her, it was not a simple invitation that could be ignored. It was a command, one that carried the weight of authority. What happened between them has been examined from every angle, but one truth remains clear: the balance of power was not equal. When Bathsheba sent word that she was pregnant, everything changed. What had been hidden could no longer remain concealed. For David, this was not just a personal issue. It was a threat to his reputation, his authority, and the image he had built over years of leadership. The child she carried was undeniable proof of what had taken place, and if the truth became known, it would expose the king in a way that could not be undone. Faced with this reality, David made a decision. Instead of admitting what he had done, he chose to cover it up. He called Uriah back from the battlefield, presenting it as an act of kindness, a chance for the soldier to rest and spend time with his wife. On the surface, it seemed reasonable, even generous. But beneath it was a plan to shift the truth, to make it appear as though the child belonged to Uriah. Uriah returned, but his response was not what David expected. While the king lived in comfort, Uriah remained committed to the reality of war. He refused to go home, choosing instead to stay with the other soldiers. His reasoning was simple. How could he enjoy rest while his fellow men were still fighting? His sense of duty overruled any personal desire, and in doing so, he unknowingly disrupted David's plan. Even when David attempted to change his behavior by offering him wine, hoping that it would lower his guard, Uriah remained firm. His loyalty stood in stark contrast to the king's actions, highlighting a truth that David could not ignore. The man he was trying to deceive was more honorable than he had become. With his initial plan failing, David took a step that would define this story forever. He wrote a message to his commander, instructing that Uriah be placed in the most dangerous part of the battle and then abandoned. It was a calculated decision, one that ensured Uriah would not survive. The most chilling part was how it was carried out. Uriah himself delivered the message, trusting that it contained nothing more than military instructions. He had no reason to doubt the king he served. He carried his own fate in his hands without knowing it. The plan was executed, and Uriah was killed. To the outside world, it appeared as another casualty of war, a soldier who had fallen in battle. But the truth was far more deliberate. This was not a random loss. It was the result of a decision made within the walls of the palace. After Uriah's death, Bathsheba mourned, and when the time of mourning ended, David brought her into his house as his wife. What might have appeared as an act of care was in reality the final step in concealing what had taken place. The king had taken the wife of his soldier, arranged the soldier's death, and then incorporated her into his own household. For a time, it may have seemed as though everything had been resolved. The secret was buried, the evidence removed, and life continued. But there are moments when actions carry consequences that cannot be avoided, no matter how carefully they are hidden. The turning point came through the prophet Nathan. Instead of confronting David directly, Nathan presented a story, one that seemed unrelated at first. He spoke of a rich man who had many flocks and herds, and a poor man who had only one lamb, which he cherished deeply. When a traveler came to the rich man, instead of taking from his own abundance, he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it as a meal. David, hearing this, was outraged. His sense of justice was immediate and strong. He declared that the man who had done this deserved punishment. It was then that Nathan delivered the words that would expose everything. "You are the man!" In that moment, the weight of David's actions became undeniable. The story was not about someone else. It was about him. The king who had judged another had unknowingly judged himself. What followed was not just personal realization, but divine judgment. The child born to Bathsheba fell ill, and despite David's prayers and fasting, the child died. It was a loss that reflected the seriousness of what had taken place. But the consequences did not end there. Within David's own household, conflict began to grow. His family, once a symbol of unity, became divided by violence, betrayal, and rebellion. The effects of that single decision extended far beyond what he could have imagined. Yet even within this story, there was a continuation that few would have expected. Bathsheba remained, and in time, she gave birth to another son, Solomon. This child would go on to become one of Israel's greatest kings, known for wisdom and prosperity. Bathsheba, once defined by the events that brought her into the palace, became a figure of influence, playing a role in ensuring Solomon's place on the throne. Her story did not end in silence. It evolved, shaped by circumstances that forced her into positions she may never have chosen, yet navigated in a way that secured her future. This story leaves questions that continue to resonate. It is a story of power and its misuse, of decisions made in moments that lead to lasting consequences, and of how individuals respond when confronted with their own actions. David's legacy is not erased by this event, but it is forever marked by it. Bathsheba's role is not easily defined, but it is central to understanding what took place. Uriah's loyalty remains a reminder of integrity in contrast to betrayal, and the outcome of it all challenges us to consider what justice, accountability, and redemption truly mean. So as you reflect on this story, ask yourself this: was Bathsheba simply a victim of circumstance, or did she become something more within the system she was placed in? Did David fully face the weight of what he had done, or were the consequences a reflection of something greater? And if you had been in that moment, standing on that rooftop, would your decision have been any different? The death of the child marked a turning point in the life of King David, but it did not bring an end to the consequences of his actions. In the quiet that followed, there was no immediate collapse of the throne, no sudden loss of power, no public stripping of his crown. Instead, what came was something slower, something far more personal. The fractures began within his own house. The same palace that once echoed with celebration would soon become a place of grief, tension, and betrayal. And while David remained king over Israel, the authority he carried outwardly no longer reflected the turmoil growing beneath the surface. Time passed, and Bathsheba bore another son, a child named Solomon. Unlike the first, this child lived, and his birth carried a sense of restoration, though not without memory of what had been lost. David loved Solomon, and the prophet Nathan gave him a name that signified favor. For a moment, it seemed as though peace might return, as though the worst had passed. But the consequences spoken over David's house were not confined to a single event. They unfolded gradually, touching every corner of his family. David had many sons, and among them was Amnon, his firstborn. Amnon became consumed with desire for his half-sister Tamar, a desire that grew unchecked, mirroring in disturbing ways the lack of restraint that had once overtaken David himself. Tamar was innocent, and what followed was an act that shattered her life and exposed a new layer of brokenness within the royal household. Amnon violated her, and afterward cast her aside, leaving her in shame and isolation. When news reached David, he was angry, but his response stopped there. The king who had once delivered justice with conviction now hesitated within his own home. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was the memory of his own actions. Whatever the reason, his silence created space for further tragedy. Tamar's brother Absalom did not remain silent. He watched, he waited, and he carried his anger quietly for 2 years. Then, in a calculated act of revenge, he arranged for Amnon to be killed. What began as a private violation turned into bloodshed between brothers. The royal family was unraveling, and the violence that had once been outside the palace walls had now entered it. Absalom fled, distancing himself from the consequences of his actions, while David mourned the loss of one son and the separation from another. The weight of leadership had become entangled with the weight of fatherhood, and neither could be separated from the past decisions that had set these events in motion. Eventually, Absalom returned to Jerusalem, but the relationship between him and David was no longer whole. There was distance, tension, and unresolved pain. Over time, that tension grew into ambition. Absalom began to position himself among the people, presenting himself as a leader who understood their needs, who listened where others did not. Slowly, he gained their favor, building a following that would one day challenge the authority of his own father. This was not just rebellion. It was a direct threat to the throne. When Absalom finally declared himself king, the situation escalated beyond internal conflict. David, the man who had once faced enemies without fear, now found himself fleeing Jerusalem to escape his own son. The king who had conquered nations was now running from his household. It was a moment of deep humiliation, one that reflected not weakness in battle, but the consequences of choices made years before. As David left the city, he wept, ascending the Mount of Olives in sorrow, a powerful image of a leader brought low not by external forces, but by the unraveling of his own family. The conflict between David and Absalom would end in tragedy. Despite David's instructions to spare his son, Absalom was killed during the battle that followed. When news reached David, his response was not one of victory, but of overwhelming grief. He cried out for Absalom, expressing a sorrow that revealed the depth of his loss. This was not just the end of a rebellion. It was the loss of a son, a relationship that had never been restored. And in that moment, the cost of everything that had unfolded became painfully clear. Through all of this, Bathsheba remained within the palace, her position evolving as the years passed. She was no longer defined solely by the circumstances that had brought her there. She became a figure of influence, particularly as Solomon grew. When David's strength began to decline in his later years, a new challenge emerged, one that would determine the future of the kingdom. Another of David's sons, Adonijah, sought to claim the throne. He gathered support, positioning himself as the next king, acting without the full consent of his father. It was in this moment that Bathsheba's role became critical. Alongside the prophet Nathan, she approached David, reminding him of his promise that Solomon would succeed him. This was not a passive act. It required awareness, courage, and timing. Bathsheba understood the stakes, and she moved within the structures of power to secure her son's future. David responded, giving orders that ensured Solomon would be publicly anointed as king. The transition was swift, and it prevented Adonijah's claim from taking hold. Solomon's rise to the throne marked the beginning of a new chapter for Israel. His reign would be characterized by wisdom, prosperity, and the building of the temple. And at the center of his early reign was Bathsheba, now recognized as the Queen Mother, a position of significant honor and influence. The woman who had once been summoned in secrecy now stood openly within the highest levels of authority, her voice carrying weight in the royal court. As the years passed, the story of David, Bathsheba, and Uriah remained embedded in the history of Israel, not as a simple narrative of right and wrong, but as a complex account of human decisions, power, and consequence. David continued to rule, to write, to lead, and to seek forgiveness, but his legacy was forever marked by what had taken place. Bathsheba's life became part of a larger story, one that moved beyond the moment she was first seen from a rooftop. And then, generations later, her name appeared again in a context that few could have anticipated. In the genealogy that traces the lineage leading to Jesus Christ, she is included, though not always named directly, remembered as the wife of Uriah. This detail alone carries weight, acknowledging both her place in history and the circumstances that defined it. It is a reminder that the past is never entirely erased, but it can be woven into something greater. This story continues to raise questions that reach beyond its time. It challenges how we understand leadership, responsibility, and the use of power. It forces us to consider the impact of decisions made in private and how they can shape public outcomes. It invites reflection on justice, on mercy, and on what it means to face the consequences of one's actions while still moving forward. So now the question returns, not just to history, but to you. When power and opportunity meet in a single moment, what determines the choice that follows? And when that choice cannot be undone, what defines the path ahead? David's cry over Absalom did not fade quickly. The king who had once commanded armies now struggled to command his own grief, and for a time, even victory felt hollow. The people who had fought to preserve his throne waited for reassurance, yet their king remained overwhelmed by loss. It took the intervention of his commanders to remind him that leadership still demanded his presence, that a nation could not be governed by sorrow alone. Slowly, David returned to Jerusalem, but he did not return as the same man who once walked its streets in confidence. The weight he carried was heavier now, shaped by years of choices that had unfolded into consequences he could not escape. As stability returned to the kingdom, it became clear that David's later years would not be defined by conquest, but by endurance. His strength began to fade, and with it came the quiet urgency of succession. The question of who would sit on the throne after him was no longer distant. It was immediate, and it was dangerous. Adonijah, one of David's sons, saw opportunity in his father's weakness. He gathered support, aligning himself with influential figures, presenting himself as the natural successor. To many, his claims seemed reasonable. He had status, presence, and backing. But what he did not have was the full authority of the king's declared will. Within the palace, Bathsheba recognized the danger. She understood that power does not wait, and that silence in such a moment could mean losing everything. Alongside the prophet Nathan, she approached David with careful precision. She reminded him of his promise that Solomon, her son, was to be the one who would follow him. This was not simply a conversation. It was a decisive moment, one that required clarity in a time of uncertainty. David responded with action. He ordered that Solomon be placed on his own mule, taken to Gin, and publicly anointed as king. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was not a hidden decision. It was a declaration. The city responded immediately. The sound of celebration spread, and with it, the confirmation that Solomon, not Adonijah, had been chosen. What could have become a divided kingdom was redirected in a single act of authority. Adonijah's supporters dispersed, and his claim collapsed before it could fully take hold. Bathsheba, once brought into the palace under circumstances she did not control, now stood at the center of a moment that shaped the future of Israel. Her position had changed, not through chance alone, but through awareness of how power moved and how decisions were made. Solomon's reign began with consolidation. He secured his throne, addressed potential threats, and established order. Over time, his leadership became known for wisdom, for prosperity, and for the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, a place that would become central to Israel's identity. And within his court, Bathsheba held a place of honor. When she entered his presence, he rose to meet her, a gesture that spoke volumes about her influence. She was no longer defined by a single chapter of her life. She had become the Queen Mother, a figure whose voice carried weight in matters of the kingdom. Yet the story does not resolve into simplicity. The events that brought Bathsheba into the palace remain part of her identity, just as they remain part of David's legacy. The narrative does not erase what happened to Uriah, nor does it ignore the cost that followed. Instead, it presents a reality that is complex, where moments of failure and moments of restoration exist side by side. David continued to seek God, to lead, and to reflect, but the memory of his actions was not removed from history. It became part of it. As generations passed, the account of David and Bathsheba was preserved, not hidden. It was written, read, and remembered. And then, within the genealogies that trace the lineage leading to Jesus Christ, Bathsheba appears again, identified in connection to Uriah. This detail matters. It does not rewrite the past. It acknowledges it. It places her within a story that moves beyond kings and kingdoms, into a narrative that carries spiritual significance for millions. It is a reminder that history is not always composed of perfect figures, but of real people whose lives include both strength and failure. And so the story returns to where it began, to a rooftop in Jerusalem, to a moment that seemed small but carried immense consequence. A king looked, a decision was made, and the effects of that decision moved outward, touching lives, shaping a family, influencing a nation. What followed was not contained to a single night. It unfolded across years, across relationships, across generations. Now, as you reflect on everything you have heard, the questions remain. Was Bathsheba only a victim of circumstance, or did she become a figure who learned to navigate power in a world that offered her little control? Did David fully grasp the weight of what he had done, or were the consequences that followed the true measure of accountability? And in the end, what does this story reveal about the nature of power, responsibility, and the choices that define a life? Because the truth is, this is not just a story about the past. It is a story about human nature, about moments that test character, about decisions that cannot be undone. And perhaps the most important question is this: when faced with a moment that holds the power to change everything, what choice would you make?